Hello and welcome back to the main stage. I hope you've all had a good break and had a chance to network and also grab a beverage in the meantime, just to disconnect from the screen time that we'll be having today. My name is Josephine Jenga and I am a program manager here at CPA UK, and I'll be hosting this particular session. This session, a spotlight on historic and emerging trends in exploitation and their root causes, will be in two parts. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Pirosha Chandran, who will provide an overview of the root causes of exploitation and vulnerabilities, and then the audience will then be invited to join the breakout rooms. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Pirosha Chandran, who is a human rights barrister based at One Pump Court Chambers in London, and is a world-leading expert on the law relating to human trafficking and other forms of modern slavery, including for the United Nations and the Council of Europe. Hi, Pirosha.
Hi, Joe. Nice to meet you.
You too. I'd like to hand over to you, and then I'll explain the breakout sessions after.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to engage on the most important matter of modern slavery of our times. Things have just been getting worse as the months have been progressing. And we should all be in a grave position of desire to try to help and understand, to act and to be dynamic about changing things and protecting more victims, prosecuting more perpetrators, and finding better ways to prevent modern slavery in all of its forms. I'd like to thank the CPA UK for having engaged me as a senior legal expert for the last 3 years in their modern slavery project. It's been a true honour to work with them, and to all the visionary parliamentarians and teams across the world of in the Commonwealth to help you in your drive towards protecting your populations and your guests from trafficking and modern slavery. I'd also like to congratulate the Policy and Evidence Centre upon its online launch today. I wish Murray Hunt, friends and colleagues there, all the best for the future and look forward to collaborating. I've been asked to just introduce this session briefly, which will be ultimately a number of breakout rooms dealing with different topics. Importantly, looking at child exploitation, forced labour, debt bondage, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, including of children through means of the internet, and the exploitation of persons for criminal activities and forced begging. This summary presentation of mine really is calling upon my experiences of working in this field over the last 20 years, and also the insights of the UN Special Rapporteurs on slavery and on human trafficking. I congratulate Professor Tomoya Obokata on his new role, and also Dr. Siobhan Mullally, who has taken over as the new Special Rapporteur on trafficking, both of whom are good colleagues of mine. So, looking at causes of exploitation, well, you'll know, of course, from the Palermo Protocol that it contained a closed list of exploitation when it was drafted in 2000. At that time, the predominant forms that were looked at were sexual exploitation, forced labour, slavery, servitude, also the removal of organs. Human trafficking definition is, of course, different to the definition of slavery and forms one of the types of contemporary slavery in today's world. There are freestanding forms of slavery as well, which fall under this umbrella that we call modern slavery, which consists independently of the criminal nature of forced labour, slavery, servitude, debt bondage, forced marriage, including of children. And increasingly, we're seeing the use of victims in criminal exploitation. Also, we're looking at more forms of exploitation, including orphanage trafficking, which I'll come to in a moment. What about the recruitment of children and vulnerable adults by armed groups and terrorist groups? These are again, emerging forms of exploitation we're seeing. And the sale of persons is unfortunately still a predominant form of modern slavery in today's world that may not be directly included in a state's trafficking laws. One of my experiences as a lawyer in this field was to promote the introduction of freestanding offences of forced labour, slavery and servitude into the UK's laws in 2009. And this was because whilst it's sometimes possible to see who has recruited, received, harboured, transported or transferred a person for the purpose of exploitation, when a person is found in a condition of exploitation akin to slavery, servitude or forced labour, then it should also be possible to prosecute the perpetrator for those freestanding criminal offences. These are criminal offences which arise from the Slavery Convention of 1926, from the Forced Labour Convention of 1930, and supplementary conventions thereafter. But what are the causes, the root causes of modern slavery? Well, we see increasingly vulnerability as being a preponderant feature. We've always known that factors such as age, gender, income, employment status, education levels, health, and other factors relating to social isolation can impact on the exposure of a person to being subjected to slavery in any one of its forms, or exploitation in any one of its forms. We also are increasingly seeing that being a migrant, being a refugee, a displaced person or an asylum seeker, these also appear particularly to heighten the risk of slavery. And all of these factors are made very well in terms of being highlighted by the report of the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery of July 2019. The Urmila Bula, who again is a very close and good colleague in the field, in her report, which deals very closely with the context of current and emerging forms of slavery, and frankly, in this modern slavery conference, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the extreme forms of exploitation that constitutes any type of restriction on the liberty of a person, such as to diminish the human dignity and the choices that a person can make. Then the other causes of exploitation that we're looking at needs to be considered in the context of modern day circumstances. We've seen the economic features that have been affected by COVID around the world. And these also impact on forms of exploitation. So, for example, in a country where child marriage might have been an ongoing form of exploitation, we're probably seeing increasing numbers of child marriages where families are so impoverished they can't look after their children during this time of dire economic strife. We're also seeing the emergence, an increasing preponderance of the internet being used for the exploitation of children and other vulnerable persons. What COVID has done is to limit freedom of movement in many forms, as you know. And when victims are therefore trapped in a home or in a place from which they can achieve no protection, then the perpetrators are able to exploit and harm even more. So this brings me to another very important feature when we're looking at causes of exploitation, which is that we must never lose sight of the perpetrator as being the cause of the exploitation. It's the perpetrator's greed and their intention to profit from the human suffering of the victim in whatever form that takes that lies behind the whole structure of modern slavery in today's world. And so in all of our work in the field, not only are we continuously needing to look at vulnerability and risk factors of individuals, but how to better expose the criminality of the perpetrators. Something else I wanted to mention in this session briefly is a number of years ago in 2012, I was on the group of experts for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And they were looking at the definition of abuse of a position of vulnerability. My advice was that this should be looked at in the context of various forms of vulnerability. And my suggestion was adopted, which is to look at the personal, situational, or circumstantial situation of the alleged victim. So personal vulnerability can relate to a person's physical or mental disability. Situational vulnerability may relate to a person being in a foreign country in which he or she is socially or linguistically isolated. Circumstantial vulnerability may relate to a person's unemployment or economic destitution. Now, any one of these vulnerabilities can be pre-existing, but also created by the trafficker. And this is something that is also going on today, whereby created vulnerabilities may engage social, cultural, or linguistic isolation, or a dependency, for example, cultivated through drug addiction, or romantic or emotional attachment, or through the use of cultural or religious rituals or practices. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because some of the features of exploitation that have been occurring, not only in your countries, but in mine, have related to traffickers taking advantage increasingly of vulnerabilities in such a way as to abuse them and to take control of the victim. And from that position, it is very difficult for a victim to ever stand forward and say, this happened to me, because they feel that they have a hand in their own fate. Apart from income disparities and poverty as well, we're also seeing, of course, as you know, I mentioned earlier, the increase of victims being used for criminal exploitation, criminal activities. And it's therefore very important for states to review their legislation and to make sure that their laws actually criminalize not only the holding of a person in slavery, servitude, or forced labor, in addition to trafficking a person for any one of those purposes, but they must also include in the list of exploitation to which a person can be subjected criminal activities. Because unless it's there, then it's very difficult to prosecute a perpetrator for having used a person for that aim. And yet it is, of course, the person who is being forced into committing the criminal offence that may often come to the attention of the authorities first. So these are just some things. Another aspect of great importance is, of course, orphanage trafficking. It's a new phrase coined by a brilliant lawyer in Australia, Kate Van Dor. I've been working with Lumos, J.K. Rowling's Children's Foundation, and with CPA to look at how to criminalise orphanage trafficking. This is the recruitment of children into orphanages, which are predominantly there for profit, a criminal front to pretend to be caring for children, where in fact all of the money that they achieve goes into the pockets of criminals and not towards the care or humanitarian assistance of children. So this is again an emerging form of exploitation. during the situation of COVID, we see that families may be increasingly trying to find solutions for their children to put them in better circumstances of health or welfare or financial aid. And so there are increasing opportunities for exploiters and enslavers, human traffickers and criminal networks to act very quickly, very sophisticatedly, and create very careful frameworks to entrap children and vulnerable people and keep them there for their own aims. I know you're all attending this conference with the great direction of combating more robustly modern slavery in your countries. I wish you all the best. Anything that we can do, I can do, please call upon us to help. I look forward to learning from you in the next sessions. Good luck and thank you.
Thank you, Paresha, for providing such a very detailed overview of the different socio-economic factors that can contribute to increasing the vulnerabilities of potential victims of modern slavery.